1 Kings 17, verses 17 through 24. After this, the son of the woman, the mistress of the house, became ill. His illness was so severe that there was no breath left in him. She then said to Elijah, "What have you against me, O man of God? You have come to me to bring my sin to remembrance and to cause the death of my son." But he said to her, "Give me your son." He took him from her bosom, carried him into the upper chamber where he was lodging, and laid him on his own bed. He cried out to the Lord, "O Lord my God, have you brought calamity even upon the widow with whom I am staying by killing her son?" Then he stretched himself upon the child 3 times and cried to the Lord, "O Lord my God, let this child's life come into him again." The Lord listened to the voice of Elijah. The life of the child came into him again, and he revived. Elijah took the child, brought him down from the upper chamber into the house, and gave him to his mother. Then Elijah said, "See, your son is alive." So the woman said to Elijah, "Now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord is in your mouth is truth." The word of the Lord. This text, it comes in the middle of a bigger story. And you know, I like to talk about text in context rather than just pulling out this story and just talking about the one story. I like to put it into the context of the whole chapter and even into the context of the whole book. In this chapter, though, Elijah just appears. I was telling Ron this morning that I always forget because Elijah is always considered and is one of the great prophets of the Old Testament. I always feel like he's around during all of the books of the prophecies, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. All of these prophets, all of these books should contain Elijah. But every time I come to this chapter, I remember, no, he appeared randomly in chapter 17 of 1 Kings. And he disappears just as quickly in 2 Kings chapter 2. Elijah's time and his time in the story may not be long, but his impact was felt throughout the history of Judaism and throughout the history of Christianity. Elijah the prophet is the great prophet. And here when he shows up, he is a man who randomly shows up. Obviously, he might have already been a man of God that they knew about, because the first thing that happens is that he appears before the king, who was not doing a very good job as king. And he tells the king, because of his disobedience, there will be a drought in the country. And then God takes him from before the king and takes him out to the river. And there Elijah is fed by the ravens and drinks the water from the river until the water dries up. The only thing we know about this prophet Elijah at the moment is that he's from Gilead, a town called Tishbe. That's it. He showed up and then he disappeared. Upon disappearing and being fed by the ravens and drinking from the water of the river until it dried up, he meets a widow who God calls him to be with, to walk with, to live with. And the poor widow is just that, a poor widow. Widows, like orphans and immigrants in the Old Testament, were those who were most vulnerable. The widow had very little food for her and her son. And this being the beginning of a drought where everything is going to dry up and die, she had but a little meal and a little water for her and her son. Yet Elijah asked her for water. And Elijah asked her to make him a cake. And her being as poor as she was, having so little as she did, she gave him and made it for him. And God provided for her and her son because the jar of meal during the rest of the drought was never empty. The jar of oil during the drought was never empty. They had water, they had oil, they had meal, and they ate during the whole time of the drought. So that brings us now to the text that we just read. Something is gone wrong. Something has gone terribly wrong. Here we have the lady, the widow, who had welcomed the man of God, and as she fed him and saw the miracle of God of multiplying food, here we see that her son, her only child, the only thing that was preventing her from becoming even more vulnerable, lay in her arms dead. Now, if we go back to the culture, a woman was not a person, but more of a property or a thing. And a widow who was alone needed a man to take care of her. This was back then. I'm all for equal rights and feminism. But back then, a woman needed a man. And though her husband had died, she still had her son, who was her protector, who was there to take care of the property, to make deals that were necessary, to do the things that a man needed to do. But now here he lay in her arms, dead. And can we blame her for her emotional outburst? Can we blame her for what she says when she says, "What have you against me?" And even worse, "Why have you brought up some sin that I forgot about? And now you're punishing me for something that I did so long ago and was forgotten." This may seem like an extreme response, but how many times don't we do that? "What have I done to deserve this?" we say. Maybe we forgot a sin and that's why we're being punished. But in fact, it's the complete opposite of what she believes it to be. Because God brought Elijah into her situation for just this moment. You see, if Elijah hadn't come and met her, if Elijah hadn't come into her house, if Elijah hadn't asked her for water, he wouldn't be there with her. And guess what? Chances are her son was going to die anyway. So then she would truly be a vulnerable widow in the midst of this society, alone, where anyone can come and take what little she had. But in that moment, she's not thinking like that. She's thinking, "Why have you come and punished me? Why did you come into my house to bring up some long forgotten sin? Why? Why and what have I done to deserve this?" We react like that quite often when we stumble or when something occurs to us in our lives. Our first reaction is, "Why? What have I done? I've tried to do everything right, and yet here I am again." Or here I am, broken. But yet we have to look around us and understand that there are things, there are people, there are situations that we are in and have been in, but God is present with us. If Elijah is not there, if God does not bring Elijah into this woman's life, truly she would have been left alone. Truly, she wouldn't have had anyone. Truly, it would have been done. But God had other plans. God brought Elijah into her house because God knew what she needed. Even though the food was important, yes. But God knew that new life, renewed life, had to come into this household, and they didn't even know it. And that's what Elijah brings. Elijah takes this dead son, pleads with God, and new life is breathed into him. New life is brought into him. New life is brought into the household. God knew what she needed before she needed it. She couldn't understand that because at the moment, it was why. At the moment, it was how could you do this? At the moment, it was what have I done to deserve this? But how does this speak to us today? How do we bring this old story of this great prophet, bringing life into this child, into this home? How do we bring that to our today? For me, I look at it as we as Christians, as people of God, are called to be bringers of life. We as people of God are called to speak life into things. We as people of God are called to be light in the midst of darkness that's around us. We as people of God should inspire people with how we live our lives. Because our lives, our testimony, our story, we will inspire people when we demonstrate our faith. People will feel comfortable and share with us, and we can help them to get through what they're going through. If we're willing to listen, maybe one day those same people will want to be just like you. They will want what you have. They will become light in the midst of darkness. They will become life in the midst of a dead society. But we have to live that out, speak it out, be that light, because otherwise people will be distracted if we're living one way but talking another way. And we know many of them. We know many people who say, "Oh, I love the Lord," and then they turn around and live a life that is unworthy of God. We know people who are praising God on church on Sunday, and then they go out the rest of the week and they talk negative words and break down people with their gossip, with their negativity, with their destructive words. We must live a life worthy of God. We cannot live a day worthy of God and then live the other 6 days as we want to. You can't be light on Sundays and darkness the rest of the week. People will see, people will want, people will point out the hypocrisy within us. They're quick to do that. We're surrounded by people who are very much like this widow. People who are lost. People who are struggling. People who are trying to make it through the day, hoping that maybe I will see tomorrow. People who are living in a moment of, why, God? What have I done to deserve this? Why are you punishing me? And if we are bringing negativity instead of encouragement, if we are being negative people bringing death rather than life, those people who are living in brokenness will continue to be broken. Too often, we are quick to spit venom than to provide words of hope. We'll say, look at this person, look at them, how terrible they are. But they don't need that. They need encouragement. Too often, instead of acting in love, we rather just push them aside and say, pick yourself up by your own bootstraps. We can't feel empathy because we can't see in others what God has done in us, so we think ourselves more highly. Instead of being self-focused and self-centered, we need to look at others and see them for what they are, for who they are, for what they're going through. It doesn't mean that we ignore ourselves, but it forces us to see ourselves through their eyes. And it forces us to want to help those who are struggling. That's why we are the church. That's why we believe what we believe. That's why we should be bringers of life, breathing life into dead situations. Because when we do that, God will put us in the right situation at the right time. Not meaning that God is going to give you the career and the job that you want to make millions of dollars, but that God will place you somewhere like God placed Elijah, where life is needed, and you will be the bringer of that light. Where this woman felt that God had brought death upon her family, where Elijah had been a culprit of bringing death into her family, yet it was God through Elijah who intervened and brought life where death was imminent. If we are people of life, if we are people that bring life, if we are people that inject life into situations and into circumstances that are dying, then God will be able to use us in ways that we could not have imagined. But we have to be children of life. We have to bring life into all situations. We have to bring light into dark places. When we read this text, when we read this chapter, we also see that God did not want to separate this child from their parents, from their one parent, the widow. God listens to Elijah's pleas because God fully understands the importance of this young man. God chooses not to separate the child from their parent. Instead, God reconnects and brings new life into the child in order to renew the hope and the life of the mother. After he returns, she states how truly now she knows that Elijah is a man of God and that God is real. Elijah was in the right place at the right time. Are we being in the right place at the right time? The circumstances in this nation at our borders shows that parents are being separated from their children. Are we being people of life and light? Are we willing to work to bring them back together? Are we willing to intercede not only in prayer, but to find a way to intervene so that parents and children will not be separated? God did not want this son to be separated from his mother. God does not want children to be separated from their parents. We know of so many situations where children suffer because of what's happening in the world around them. This is a situation that doesn't have to be that, but yet it has become that. Are we willing to take a stand? Are we willing to make a call? Are we willing to call our congressmen or whoever it is in leadership that can help reconnect and bring together children and parents, like Elijah brought this son and this mother back together? God is calling us to be life bringers. God is calling us to be here at the right time, to be here in the right place, so that we can be people of life in dead situations, so that we can be people of light in dark situations. May the Lord grant us the wisdom needed to do what needs to be done. And may the Lord have mercy on us if we fail to stand up for justice, if we fail to stand up for what is needed, if we fail to do what God is calling us to do. May God forgive us for doing those things, or I should say, for not doing the things that are needed. Now let us sing our hymn of response, number 284.